Hello, I'm Joseph Menn. I'm a journalist, and this is Fatal System Error 2, More Fatal Than Ever. In this talk, I want to revisit my 2010 book, Fatal System Error, which at the time was the first mainstream book to talk about how dire the cybersecurity landscape was. And since then, of course, it's gotten much worse. When I picked the title Fatal System Error, the idea was that it was the system as a whole, the combination of porous technology, geopolitics, and lax law enforcement capability that had created this very, very serious problem, in particular, an alliance between organized criminal groups and certain governments, especially in Russia and Ukraine at the time. And Fatal System Error was meant to be kind of a grabber, because one of the problems is that these issues are frequently so abstract, or were frequently so abstract, that it was hard to get people up in arms and really committed to doing something about the problem, as intractable as it was. That's no longer the case. Now people are actually dying. There are ransomware attacks crippling hospitals that are costing beds and resulting in an inability to do basic tests for people that need surgery and the like. And so people are actually dying from poor cybersecurity. And so it is long past time to take these challenges on more seriously. And I'm actually happy to report that some things are actually happening now. Some of the things that should have been happening when I was trying to get to happen when I wrote the book 12 years ago are actually finally happening now. Better late than never, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But first, I'd like to say a little bit about myself and why Texas is important to me. So I'm a mainstream journalist. I've written for major publications for my whole career, more than 25 years now. That includes the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, and most recently Reuters, where I've been doing investigative work on cybersecurity and privacy for the last 10 years. I've also written 3 solo books, and I guess my journey into the heart of cybersecurity began with the first one, which was called All the Rave, and was like the definitive inside history of Napster. And Napster was a super interesting story, because it was kind of what you get when you combine cutting-edge technology that's rapidly developing and Silicon Valley greed and impatient, amoral youth. And they together take on one of the most dinosaur-like establishments, the record business in that case. But despite the fact that Napster was one of the best-known brands in the United States and a lot of the world 20 years ago. And Sean Fanning, the founder, was on the cover of Time magazine. Relatively few people knew what was really going on, some very fundamental things about Napster. One was that Sean Fanning, from the moment of incorporation, did not have control of Napster. It was actually his uncle John, who had a history of failed businesses and bad debts and unhappy employees. Another was that their business strategy was basically extortion. They were going to, even though it was, legally they were on extremely shaky ground, their plan was to get so big, so fast, and know more about the record industry customers than the record industry itself, so that they would be willing to pay what they hoped would be billions of dollars to make Napster go away or to convert it into something legal. And a third thing that people didn't know about Napster is that Sean Fanning was a straight-up hacker. He, worked on port scanning, and he used as beta testers members of IRC channels, including Pound Hack, that were devoted to issues of hacking. In fact, he was sort of like the first kind of good guy, personable hacker that people were rooting for, that got quite popular, less geeky than Bill Gates and even Steve Jobs. So the teens could relate. But through working on that book, I got to know many very serious hackers and very talented security people, and they kind of drove home to me how desperate the state of cybersecurity was at that time in the early '00s. And I continued to work on the beat for the LA Times, and I noticed there's this big inflection point that people missed around 2003, 2004. Now, before that time, if something went wrong with your computer, it was kind of random, or you screwed up, or somebody was pulling a prank, or somebody was wanted to impress a stripper and wrote a virus called Melissa and infected your computer. After 2004, if something went wrong with your computer, it was the result, most likely, of organized crime. And this is for very pedestrian reasons. There were spammers who were making decent money, and spam was so ubiquitous that finally sysadmins got around to blacklisting various IP addresses, known bad IP addresses, and from addresses. So the spammers needed a bunch of clean IP addresses to send their stuff, and so they hired virus writers who could round up a whole bunch of computers and harness them to the cause, or they hired bot herders who had already done that, collected these captive machines for use in sending spam. So they did that, and then they've got all these captive machines, and they're looking for other ways to monetize it. And so they start launching denial of service attacks and extorting websites, saying, we're going to knock over your website, and if you don't pay us $20,000 by Western Union, then your website's going to stay down. So it's actually what's happening today with ransomware, only at a less sophisticated level. But I got quite interested in this because it wasn't particularly sophisticated technologically, but as a business model and as an illustration of the kind of smash and grab mentality that was growing and wasn't particularly stoppable. I thought it was a fairly good way to tell the story. Now, one of the strange things about it is when these denial of service extortionists were just getting going, one of their earliest targets were offshore gambling sites serving U.S. bettors, and that seems kind of like an odd choice. But consider that they had pretty poor infrastructure, being in smaller Central American countries. They couldn't go to the FBI because the FBI considered what they were doing illegal, and they had plenty of cash, and they could not, under any circumstances, be down on Super Bowl Sunday or the like. So they were attacking these companies, and I found out about that. And then I called them and I said, "So what happened? How were you able to get back online? Who helped you?" And a couple of them pointed me to a young security professional in California named Barrett Lyon. Now, Barrett, had protected them. He did a denial of service mitigation strategy, but I thought he was worth talking to. So he happened to be in San Francisco, so he came into my office, and he's in his early to mid 20s, and he's wearing flip flops and shorts. And I said, "So you protected all these gambling sites from these denial of service attackers?" And he was like, "Yep, figured out a way to do it. It was fairly efficient. Gave me some geeky stuff." I'm like, "Okay, that's interesting. That's important, but it's not much of a grabber. Did you ever figure out who was behind the attacks?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I chatted to them." I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, so what I did is they were directing the bots through internet relay chat. So I got onto the channel that they were doing it in, and I pretended that I was a bot herder too, and they had hijacked my bots. And so it took a couple months, but I eventually a couple of them trusted me, and I suggested that we work together." I'm like, "That's incredible. You don't have any transcripts of this, do you?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, here they are." And I said, "Well, this is great. You never figured out who they were, did you? I mean, real name or anything?" He's like, "Yeah, I got one guy's real IP address. He forgot to use a VPN one time, and I was able to he let something else slip, and I was able to come up with his name." I'm like, "This is incredible." So I wrote a story about Barrett's war against these Russian extortionists. And then eventually that became fatal system error, or a large part of fatal system error. There's American cyber mob in there too, but he was the first time I really got lucky and found a way to kind of explain what was going on over there. And then I got lucky again because it turns out that while the FBI wasn't interested in protecting these groups, after the Russians had built up a pretty good revenue stream, they went after other companies, including publicly traded British gambling firms, which are legal. And the UK had just set up something called the National High-Tech Crime Unit, which was pretty far ahead of its time and included intelligence, operations, and very good police and other elements of the government, including the diplomatic corps, could be involved. So they took Barrett's research very seriously. And after the same gang was going after British companies, they sent a Welsh detective named Andy Crocker to Russia to work on the case. And he lived in Russia for the better part of 3 years to bring these guys to justice, and actually succeeded. So a very, very unusual story. This was during a relative high point in Russian-UK cooperation. It was before some assassinations, in particular Litvinenko in London. Jack Straw, who's the British Foreign Secretary, asked his opposite number in Moscow for help on this case. And so there was a great deal of pressure brought to bear. And Andy was, extraordinarily dedicated, learned the ways of Russia. And worked on this case. He discovered that cybercrime is pretty rampant, particularly cybercrime against Western companies. And this is for like a number of reasons that I want to explain a little bit, because if you haven't spent time in Russia, it's sort of hard to understand. The reason that there is so much cybercrime in Russia and neighboring countries has to do with a number of factors. One is the technical skills are very high. In Russia, math and engineering are admired skills. There isn't any sort of prejudice against geeks or nerds. So that's one thing. There are a lot of they're very serious academic programs. People get very good. But there is no Silicon Valley. There is no obvious way to get a lot of money from these skills in legitimate businesses. Russia is trying to create a Silicon Valley, but it's not, it's not like it is here. Third factor is that crime is just not seen as that bad. It's just kind of a fact of life, and particularly if you're committing crimes against people who live in other countries, it's not looked down upon. In fact, their Hacker magazine celebrates the exploits of the more successful hackers, and it's got them, on the cover of their magazine with sports cars and models and gold jewelry, and it's a cool thing. And then the last factor for why this is so big, why cybercrime is so big, is that the corruption is really mind-blowing. Russia is an incredibly corrupt place. The police and the other public servants make very little money from their official salaries, so they supplement that by shaking various people down, and that's kind of just the way things are there. If I could explain it in one way, one way to look at it is that why is it that of all the jobs in law enforcement you can have in Moscow, the one that pays the least is basically a traffic cop, and yet that is the most sought after job because that gives you the most opportunity to interface with your public and shake down your public. Everybody there knows how corrupt it is. There's a joke that Andy was told by his friends in the MVD, the equivalent of the FBI over there, that goes like this. There's an American tourist in Moscow, and he has his passport stolen. And he does what he's supposed to do in a situation like that, which is he gets in touch with the U.S. Embassy. And so he says, hey, somebody stole my passport. And the embassy guy says what he's supposed to, which is like, well, did you notify the MVD? And the guy says, yeah, they say they didn't do it. So everybody knows how corrupt elements of the MVD and the FSB are. It's just the way things are. In fact, when Andy was starting to work on the case in fatal system error, it turned out that there was some tension between the MVD and the FSB, one of the main successors to the old the old main spy service there, and it turns out that there's tension over who works cybercrime cases, and that's because it's a revenue stream. It's not like the FBI and Secret Service are in a turf war because they want the glamour or the credit for taking down some real bad guys. It's because it's a revenue stream. If the MVD gets to a cybercrime kingpin first, they can see how much money they can get from him, either to avoid arrest or, if he has been arrested, to get out of jail. And the FSB, once these guys are starting to make serious money, the FSB thinks that's attractive as well. So you've got that kind of thing going on. I want to tell you, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I just want to digress a little bit and talk about why I like Texas so much. So Fatal System Error came out, as I said, in 2010, and it was depressing. Like I said, it was supposed to be depressing. It was supposed to be a wake-up call on how bad things are. The attack surface is getting bigger. Russia doesn't bother to arrest these people. It's against Russian law to extradite anybody, and they were beginning to view these hackers as a strategic asset against rival countries, including the United States. So I wrote that book, and it was big in Congress and cybersecurity. And it was depressing. And as the years go by, I didn't want to write another book that said, "Hey, things are still terrible," or "They're even worse now." So instead, I was looking to write something that was hopeful and instructive. Here are some things that work in cybersecurity, essentially. And what I hit upon was a group called the Cult of the Dead Cow. And the Cult of the Dead Cow was created in Lubbock, Texas, by some teenage bulletin board service operators who aspired to be serious hackers but weren't really. They were like, phone freaks and the like. But they morphed over time, and the Cult of the Dead Cow added some serious technical folks, and they famously released a program called Back Orifice, and then Back Orifice 2000, which were scripts that allowed anyone to hijack a Windows box. And they, it was quite controversial, but they played a huge role in forcing Microsoft to take security more seriously because they turned it into a media circus. The CDC also coined the term hacktivism, which they defined as hacking and security work in service of human rights. Hacktivism, in part because of my book, there's been this resurgence of hacktivism, new attention on it, and this has actually been the biggest year ever in hacktivism. And some of the major targets have been in Texas, including one of the sites where you could rat out somebody for getting an abortion or for assisting a woman to get an abortion after the Texas law was upheld by the courts. That got hacked. More recently, the Texas Republican Party's site got hacked, and so on and so forth. There've been it's been quite a live center for hacktivism. One of the things that's interesting to me about the Cult of the Dead Cow is that they're the longest running and most influential U.S. hacking group. Another thing is that they went outside of their areas of comfort, outside of their comfort zones. They got into, they founded $1 billion business. One of them went to run cyber grant making at DARPA. They testified before Congress. They came up with coordinated vulnerability disclosure. They did all these monumental things besides activism, and they also got into politics. So some of you may know that one of them, one of the earliest members of the Cult of the Dead Cow, is a gentleman named Beto O'Rourke. And a couple years ago, he ran for the White House, and he may soon be running for governor of Texas. So I have a special interest in Texas. So thanks for having me here. Now back to Fatal System Error. So, like I said, it's very hard to get somebody arrested, even with the kind of support that Andy got from the MVD. And they did get these guys, and they got sent off for 8 years in prison. But that's not really the point of the book. The point of the book is what happened when they tried to go upstream and get the people that were above these three extortionists that Andy caught. And if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me here, I'm gonna read a little bit from the book. Andy thought he would aim as high as possible at a man named King Arthur. Through dogged but until now secret work on the Carter Planet case, the U.S. Postal Service Greg Crabb had succeeded in identifying King Arthur as Artur Galagov, a man in his early 20s living in the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Galagov was taking in millions of dollars from Citibank phishing and other scams with the aid of numerous U.S. accomplices, according to Postal Service documents. In a meeting with two MVD men to discuss other business, Andy pressed his luck. "This case is going well. Let's keep it going. Follow this thing upstream," he told the others. "Let's go after King Arthur. He's as bad as they get, and he's gotten millions of dollars. If we get him, that will show everyone how serious the Russian government is. It could change everything." There was an awkward pause. "He's in Dagestan," one of the MVD men said. The tone reminded Andy of the famous line from Roman Polanski's great corruption movie, "Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown." "So he's in Dagestan. Great. You know where he is," Andy persisted, feigning ignorance. "It's different there. Very rough," the other man put in, as if talking to a child. "That's not a problem," Andy said. "I'm not afraid. I'll go anywhere." The MVD men exchanged looks. The first cleared his throat. "The FSB is dealing with him. They know who he is," he said, trying to sound reassuring as he brought up the spy agency that was the greatest power in the country. "Well, then the FSB can go to Dagestan," Andy said. But he sensed this wasn't going to work out. "They aren't interested in him right now," the MVD agent shrugged, signaling an end to the subject. What they didn't tell Andy was that Department K operatives had already tried to get King Arthur. They had prepared a report and sent it to the MVD Investigative Committee, asking the elite squad to conduct interviews and make an arrest. The committee never pursued the case. And he also brought up the issue with Igor Yakovlev, his closest MVD friend. "Why won't anyone arrest King Arthur?" he asked. The politically savvy Igor shrugged, said he didn't know, and gave the all-purpose explanation Andy had heard most of the days he had been in the country. "Это Russia. It is Russia." It made an unfortunate amount of sense to Andy. They've got him with the threat of 10 years in prison, he thought. They said either come work for us or go to prison. Why would he not, especially if they let him continue making money? Knowing how things worked in Russia, it was possible that King Arthur was just bribing his way to continued freedom. But that was unlikely. In the ordinary course of events, a suspect would be arrested first, giving officials the most leverage to negotiate payment. Not only had King Arthur not been arrested, no one had even come close to arresting him. Besides, too many countries had been demanding King Arthur's head for too long for a simple bribe to work. It would be too sensitive to just take money and not arrest him, Andy told a friend. So the only reason it goes nowhere is he's protected by someone. In 2009, King Arthur was still dispensing advice on Carter forums, serving as a mentor to the next generation. The bottom line is that King Arthur and others are off limits because they're extremely useful when it comes to attacking enemies of the Kremlin, be they internal political opponents or sovereign governments, such as those in Estonia and Georgia, which have had official and media sites shut down by denial of service attacks that use the infrastructure of well-known Russian criminals. So that's what it was like then. And now I'd like to turn to what's changed for better and for worse. So for worse, these guys didn't have great technical skills at the time. And the technical abilities have gotten much better. The ability to penetrate even pretty seriously defended companies and distribute ransomware, which itself is more sophisticated certainly than a denial of service attack. But really, a lot of this is about business innovation. One of the things I learned in writing the book is that the bad guys do capitalism better than we do. Defenders are unclear about where to spend their money, and it's very hard to measure the reward for the money that is invested. You don't know what works really to keep people out. You only know what fails after the fact. Whereas the bad guys can easily measure where the money comes in and do more of that. They invest in R&D. They work really long hours. They work quite hard. And they specialize. So, one guy's got, a botnet that he rents out by the day or by the hour. Somebody else is a virus writer. Somebody else specializes in gaining initial access. And then they're brokers for that access to get into a given company. Ransom, the same way that they used to say that innovation was driven by the porn industry, innovation is now really driven by the crime industry. So you have places like eBay where buyers and sellers and various vendors of services are vetted and rated. And if you're a scammer or a ripper and you rip off other criminals, then you get banned from the forum. So it's extraordinarily effective. Those are some of the things that have gotten worse. But probably, the biggest thing that has gotten worse has been the tightening of the alliance between some elements of the criminal ecosystem and major figures in the Russian government. Beforehand, like any criminal might pay somebody off, and the cyber criminals did as well. But then they started being very useful for cyber warfare against Estonia and Georgia, and others. And then, it became much more serious. As this is sort of like the wars of the future, you've got attacks in Ukraine, you've got sort of stuff that's disguised as hacktivism, that is, hacking and leaking stuff. I want to make clear, I don't want to overstate this. Most ransomware actors are common criminals in it for money. But there are times, but even then, there's an important government overlay. Certainly, if Putin wanted to crack down, he could crack down. These people could be arrested. They could be sent to jail. It is not a priority at all for the Russian government. So another thing that's gotten worse, of course, actually, is cryptocurrency. So in the old days, when Barrett and Andy were fighting these guys, the money would go to Western Union or something like that, and it would have to go to human beings in Estonia or Latvia or someplace, money mules, who would go to Western Union, physically collect the money, and then see if they were getting tailed, and then hand it off to somebody else. So there were risks of arrest, infiltration, and it was super inefficient. Cryptocurrency solves basically all of those problems. So it's a much more liquid market, unfortunately. So in terms of government overlap, we have now had documented cases where FSB officers are literally criminals. So there was a big breach at Yahoo where millions and millions of email accounts were compromised at once. In the ensuing indictment out of San Francisco, there were 2 FSB officers named in addition to sort of full-time criminals. There are people who, as in the theory about King Arthur, who go from criminal to working in-house one of the one of the major intelligence or police agencies there. Um, um, and there's a lot of moonlighting as well. In the case of of ransomware specifically, let me tell you about a man named Evgeny Bogachev. He is a Russian national charged in 2014 with running Game Over Zeus, a variant of sophisticated bank fraud software, and distributing early ransomware called CryptoLocker. Though it was not part of the indictment against Bogachev, Game Over Zeus's pattern of data collection, searching infected computers for banking passwords, included phrases like top secret, indicating a relationship with Russian intelligence. I reported earlier this year, citing former senior U.S. Justice Department official John Carlin, who oversaw the case during the Obama administration. Evil Corp, a group that the U.S. Treasury has said is led by Bogachev associate Maxim Yakubets, became the first ransomware gang to focus on big game targets likely to pay more, according to Adam Myers of CrowdStrike. A 2019 Treasury Department sanctions order accused Yakubets both of carrying out large-scale crimes and taking FSB direction. Quote, acquiring confidential documents through cyber-enabled means and conducting cyber-enabled operations on its behalf, close quote. Yakubets was indicted in the U.S. in 2019 for alleged hacking, wire fraud, and bank fraud. The U.S. has offered millions of dollars in reward money and information leading to the arrests of Bogachev and Yakubets and published photographs of them, but mysteriously they have not been apprehended by Russian authorities. Analysts told Reuters that Yakubets is married to the daughter of a former senior FSB operative, which might help even more. Okay, so that's the bad news. What has gotten better since fatal system error? Research and attribution are a lot better. It used to be, it was just extraordinarily hard to figure out whose fingers were on the keyboard. It's now, for a variety of reasons, gotten much more doable. Private industry has gotten way better, and the FBI Secret Service are much more talented in these skills. They have actual native digital experts now, which didn't used to be a thing at either agency. There's also serious cooperation between public and private entities that really was just lip service before. Even the NSA is not only identifying exploits that are in the wild, but warning the private sector about which ones are being exploited in mass, so people know what to prioritize in defense. Reporting requirements are expanding, and I think we're going to expand more soon, so the companies that are victims of ransomware will at least have to tell the feds about it, even with some sort of privacy protection. And that means that the feds can prioritize, which are the most active ransomware groups and what techniques are they using. Right now, the feds are only seeing maybe 20% of what's happening out there. There's also been an increase in naming and shaming of foreign criminals, including members of intelligence agencies in China and Russia and Iran. That's embarrassing for those countries, and it means that those people can't go to nice places on vacation because they could get caught and extradited. And it helps turn world opinion and solidify allies, which is really important in trying to combat this stuff. And then finally, this whole of government approach being undertaken by the Biden administration is starting to show some really interesting fruit. The Trump White House eliminated cyber coordinator position, was extremely reluctant to pursue sanctions against Russia for reasons I think we all know here. And that has all changed under White House. They've put into some very serious officials in roles, including the National Cyber Coordinator and a Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, Ann Neuberger. That was a position that didn't exist before. And they've worked with allies to try and press Russia to crack down and to go after the worst of the cryptocurrency exchanges that are favored by criminals for money laundering. It's a huge job. They're also trying to get legislation through Congress. It's a huge task, but the battle is finally joined. Many of these things that I called for in the last chapter of Fatal System Error are actually happening now, in terms of combating this stuff. And when I say the battle has been joined, as of this month, I can say that literally, which is really exciting. So one of the worst ransomware groups was named Revil, Revil. And they're ransomware as a service. So somebody else would break into a company, a target company, or purchase a foothold there, and then they could deploy Revil ransomware, and Revil would handle the negotiations and the publicity if they wanted to embarrass and publish information as part of a double extortion scheme, which has become pretty standard now. And is also a great way to launder intelligence goals. So Revil hit the JBS, the world's largest meatpacker, or one of them, earlier this year. They also hit Kaseya, which is super important because Kaseya made tools for software management that was deployed inside more than 1,000 businesses and other organizations. And because Revil got in through them, they were able to infect, or their affiliates were able to infect, more than 100 companies at once. So this became a top priority. And if you've listened to the rhetoric from Biden and others in the White House, they've been talking about how ransomware has become a national security issue. That's because of the hospital attacks, which again, I think are mostly about money, but are killing people in a time of a global pandemic. And attacks on places like the Colonial Pipeline, the largest gas pipeline in the United States, that led to it being shut down for days earlier this year and causing spot gas shortages in pockets of the country. Because they have deemed this a national security threat on par with terrorism, new legal authorities have been opened up, as I was able to report a couple weeks ago. That means that hacking back is a thing now, not only by the FBI or companies working for the FBI, the Secret Service, but by the NSA, which is part of the U.S. military. So when I say the battle has been joined, the battle has been joined. And the awesome power of the NSA and allied military intelligence services were actually able to penetrate Revil's servers, gather intelligence, and then when the jig was eventually up, when one of the leaders of Revil pulled the plug on it and said that they'd been compromised and wished everybody luck and disappeared. So caveats here, plenty of them. Will the people in Revil form new groups? Sure, yes. Is other ransomware software readily available? Yeah, you bet. Will this deter others? Maybe a little. It may also provoke some retribution. There were some calls for attacking U.S. assets deliberately because of the Revil shutdown. But the risk-reward ratio is changing for these criminal groups now. And you have to, if you want to knock over a business that's going to give you a lot of money, particularly if it's part of critical infrastructure, which is one of the things Biden complained about to Putin earlier this year, you risk bringing the U.S. military down on you, and also the intelligence capabilities of European partners, and that's a pretty big risk when you could, make as much money knocking over smaller places in other countries. So maybe it escalates. Maybe the criminals go elsewhere. But the U.S. is finally using its capability against these bad guys who are literally killing us and have the potential to do crippling damage to many sectors of the economy. So I'm sorry that it took this long. I'm sorry that people had to start dying for this to happen. But it has finally happened, and the world is finally engaging a very, very serious set of enemies. So that's all I have, and I guess I can take your questions on Discord or the other services now. I really appreciate the chance of being able to talk to you. If you're watching this, you're probably interested in doing good, and there are many ways of doing good. One is by hunting down these bad guys. Another now is by working inside the government, working inside some of these terrific private sector companies that are doing so much great work and great research. And then there's like really cool stuff you can do in your off time as a volunteer or as a contributor to open source projects, as the folks in the Occult of the Dead Cow made clear. So I hope you get a chance to read those books and continue to fight the good fight. Thanks very much for your time.